first of all, that less is more, and therefore that this is David Birnbaum, who is chair of Slavic at the University of Pittsburgh, and he just gave a 2-day workshop in XML, and we're delighted to have him here presenting some of his research in the digital humanities context. Welcome, David.
Thank you. Thank you all. It's good to be back. I'm going to be speaking today about patterns of transmission of cultural texts, and specifically of medieval Miscellany manuscripts. The materials I'll be discussing are from the Slavic world, roughly from the 12th through about the 15th or 16th centuries, but there's nothing specifically Slavic, or for that matter, necessarily specifically medieval, about some of the issues I'll be examining. The data that I'll be using is drawn from a project called the Repertorium of Old Bulgarian Literature and Letters, a title that was made up by people who were not native speakers of English. The materials are not necessarily Old Bulgarian. In the Slavic medieval world, the Slavs of that time would have referred to the language they were writing as Slavonic, and they wouldn't have made a big deal about the passports they were carrying. A lot of these manuscripts did originate on what is now Bulgarian territory, but others come from other parts of the Balkans and even from the East Slavic world. They're from Orthodox Slavic culture, but pretty much from all over Orthodox Slavic culture. This project was born in the mid-1990s in the Sector for Old Bulgarian Literature of the Institute of Literature of the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences. The director of that sector is Anisava Miltenova, who is my collaborator and fully a co-author of the report I'll be delivering today. The issue we were examining was the patterns in the structure of medieval Miscellany manuscripts, which in the Slavic philological tradition have been called either mixed or fixed. Neither of those terms means what you think it does, so I'll define them briefly. I'm going to talk a bit about what mixed and fixed content miscellanies are, and I'll talk about some of the research questions that Anisava and I try to explore in our studies here. I'm going to look at patterns of agreement among miscellanies, what they have in common and where they diverge, and I'm going to construct a hypothesis about how scribes decided what to include in these miscellanies as they were compiling them. I'm going to be looking at a testbed corpus of somewhat over 100 Miscellany manuscripts. That's a very large amount of data to try to keep straight in one's head or even on paper. So I'm going to discuss the results of trying to cluster the corpus, that is, to take a look at these miscellanies and try to determine which ones have things in common, which ones have patterns of agreement that philologists might care about. I'll interpret the results of that clustering and draw some conclusions about how scribes compiled their manuscripts. And then I will look more closely at some of the specific correspondences, and that I think, for me at least, will be the most interesting part of the talk. I'll show some illustrations of how miscellanies do or do not coincide in their content. And then I will conclude by trying to interpret those results and draw some conclusions about how medieval miscellanies were compiled and were transmitted. What I've put up on the screen at the moment is the full table of contents from a miscellany chosen not entirely at random. It's a mixed content miscellany, a term I will define shortly, and I'll ask you to look briefly at the contents. This manuscript contains 13 texts, and some of them have titles, some of them don't. And for the ones that don't, we know what they are. They're known texts, so we could supply them. And the interesting thing about these texts is that they have nothing in common with one another. There is no particular reason anybody would have assembled these into a book. The Patericon, our text number 1, and a different Patericon at text number 10. Patericon is a collection of stories about holy fathers, about the, sometimes some of them are about the desert fathers, some of them are about the monks in a monastery. Vita is the life of a saint. Narratives are what you think they are. Sermons are what you think they are. Over on the right side, the Nomocanon is ecclesiastical law and sort of how one runs one's monastery and one's see. The Acts is a biblical book. The last two are among my favorites. They are books of prognostication. The Brontologion interprets omens according to thunder, and the Calendologion according to, well, the calendar. So, what do these guys have in common? They can all be regarded as edifying or instructional readings for monks, and one might imagine that a monk in a monastery might have compiled lovingly one of these collections of his favorite texts and might have read it and drawn inspiration from it. But the texts nonetheless play different functions. They observe different roles. Some of them are, they were all suitable for inclusion in a monastic miscellany. On the other hand, the last two in particular verge on pseudoscience and are not religious texts in the same way as some of the others. The Revelation of St. Methodius of Patara, number 8, is an apocryphal text. The distinction between canon and apocrypha was not the same in the Orthodox Middle Ages as it is nowadays. The apocryphal texts were not canonic, but they were nonetheless not necessarily viewed as suspicious or inappropriate, so one might well have read them and studied them within a monastery. In the Slavic Middle Ages, there was a great deal of compilation of miscellany manuscripts, to the extent that scholars have hypothesized, and I think it's a pretty logical conclusion from the evidence, that compilation counted as a creative act in those days, and you could be creative not just by, say, writing the new life of a new saint that had never been written before, but also by compiling a new miscellany. By and large, miscellanies were not copied verbatim. Rather, each one is different, although some of them are very similar, as we're going to see. Miscellanies are traditionally, by Slavic philologists, divided into what are called mixed content and fixed content. What's the deal with mixed content is that those are manuscripts where the texts, or we sometimes call them articles, have no discernible connection. They don't all belong to the same genre. They're not by the same author. They don't fulfill the same function in a community or a society, and the miscellany we were just looking at is of that type. The fixed content miscellanies are not actually fixed, but what they are is relatively fixed. So the term fixed content miscellany is applied to miscellanies where the texts do have a natural connection. Sometimes it's genres, so a miscellany might contain nothing but the lives of saints. You might have a miscellany that's a collection of writings attributed to St. John Chrysostom, some of which might actually be by St. John Chrysostom. You could have a miscellany such as a prayer book or a service book where the texts are collected according to their function. You could have a miscellany that was organized by the calendar. A monology is a collection of readings according to the church calendar. One of the manuscripts I'm studying now is a monology for the month of March. It's a collection of lives of saints for that month, and that was the selectional principle, and they were arranged according to the dates in March in which they were commemorated. So the contents of a fixed content miscellany are constrained. They are not fixed. There is no fixed makeup of a prayer book. There is no fixed makeup of a monology for March. You're not going to find a saint who's commemorated in August, but there was no central canonization authority in the Orthodox Church, which means you could have been a saint in one village but not in the next village, and therefore you could have been included in a calendar in a manuscript written in one place but not in another. So the contents are constrained, but they aren't fixed. Interestingly, the order may be constrained, and the order may be constrained for logical reasons. For example, one might find the texts in, say, a prayer book or a service book organized according to the type of prayer or the type of service. So there was a type of prayer book that a monk would have stuck in his back pocket when he went on the road, and it might have the funeral readings for a monk, followed by funeral readings for a prince, followed by funeral readings for a woman, followed by funeral readings for various other identifiable categories, and it makes a certain amount of sense to group those together. They are not necessarily in any particular order, but you wouldn't be surprised to find them in the same part of the book. And then, of course, you could have texts arranged by the calendar, if that's the selectional principle. So fixed content miscellanies have contents that are constrained and may have order that may be partially constrained. Mixed content miscellanies, on the other hand, are free-for-alls. As we saw in the sample on the previous slide, the scribe could choose what he wanted, put it in whatever order he wanted. So if you take two miscellanies and put them side by side, which we will do a bit later today, they may or may not contain some of the same texts. And when they do contain some of the same texts, those texts may or may not be in the same order. It is traditional to notice the contents of miscellany manuscripts, and the descriptions normally list the order. Attention to the order has been less in the scholarly tradition, so it's very common for people to say these manuscripts have some of the same texts. There may have been some shared textual transmission, although the idea of noticing that they have the same text in the same order isn't new. People were doing that 100 years ago, not as many people who should have, because when you think about it, having the same texts and having the same texts in the same order tell you very different things about how the miscellanies were compiled, and that's going to be the focus of much of what I'm going to say today. It's very rare to have miscellanies that are exact copies of other miscellanies, and this is why I spoke of compilation as a creative act. There are scribal traditions where you are supposed to copy a text exactly as you find it. There are scribal traditions in which there are known errors in the text, and it is a requirement that you copy those errors exactly as you find them. That's not the case in the Slavic Middle Ages. Scribes could write what they pleased, and they felt free to correct their text. They were supposed to write correctly. They had their own, sometimes charmingly idiosyncratic sense of what counted as writing correctly. And it wasn't surprising, and indeed might be expected, that a scribe would select the texts he wanted and put them into his miscellany. Nonetheless, one finds partial correspondence, and sometimes very extensive, albeit partial correspondence, in the content and the order of mixed content miscellanies. And if scribes can really compile a book based on their favorite texts, one wouldn't expect to find the degree of coincidence one finds. You might imagine that there are some texts that are extremely popular and they show up frequently, but to find sequences of the same texts in the same order when they have nothing in common and no reason to be sequenced is inconsistent with the assumption that a scribe could simply write what he pleased, unless one extends that and says that what pleased him was somehow constrained. And that's going to be another focus of what we'll say today. So we're going to look at what determined the choice and arrangement of texts. On the one hand, anything goes. And as we saw in that sample, anything goes. On the other hand, the correspondences among miscellanies are much too consistent for it to be the case that anything goes. So the question that we naturally ask ourselves is, well, how did scribes decide what to include? And why do we find the correspondences that we find? Now, we can't sit at their elbows as they compile their manuscripts, so we draw inferences from the evidence they've left us. And the inferences are, I think, consistent with the evidence. I can't prove that this is what went through a scribe's mind. On the other hand, I think it's a natural and perhaps even obvious explanation of what they were doing. Some of the questions that we ask ourselves when we look at mixed content miscellanies are, given a corpus of, say, 100 miscellanies, we might pick one that interests us and ask, are there any others that have a lot of texts in common with it, that are similar with it? And that might tell us something about where it came from, what other manuscripts it could be related to, where it fits in the cultural tradition. And it's not uncommon, if you have a manuscript that contains a particularly interesting text, to go look and find which other manuscripts contain that text. That's a fairly simple question. Even with a large corpus of manuscripts, you can flip through the tables of contents and you can find what you're looking for if you're looking for a single text. If you're looking for a set of texts, it becomes a little harder. If you have a manuscript that contains, say, 15 different texts in a particular order, and you want to find which other manuscripts in your corpus contain the largest number of those texts in the same order, whether that's manageable depends on how many manuscripts you're looking at, how many texts you have in common, whether it's a single sequence or several, etc. So that's the easiest of the questions. Much harder is number two, and on an upcoming slide I'll say something about the mathematics of why number two is harder. But if you imagine you have 100 manuscripts and you're not starting with any particular one, you just say, here's 100 manuscripts, tell me which ones I should look at side by side. Think about how a human being might go about doing this. So once you've determined which manuscripts to look at side by side, that is to say which ones have something in common, You then might want to ask yourself, what are the patterns of agreement? Is it in fact the case that that anything goes, or are there ways in which manuscripts frequently are similar, and then ways in which they're not necessarily frequently similar? And a subsidiary question might be, are there stable clusters of texts that travel together? That is to say, when you find these recurring sequences of text, is it a different recurring sequence every time, or are there some that emerge across the tradition? I think the final question, and I suppose I'm telegraphing the answer just by asking it, is whether mixed content miscellanies can also be viewed as fixed, that is to say, can also be regarded as having their contents constrained, even if not in obvious ways. So if you find a set of mixed content miscellanies that nonetheless have the same sequences of texts across them, even if you can't identify a selectional or organizational principle that would have caused those to be grouped together, they nonetheless seem to travel together. So there is something that makes that an identifiable unit. And in that sense, you're not dealing with an anything goes mixed content miscellany tradition anymore. I want to say some preliminary things for the benefit of those who don't work with medieval manuscript studies, because a lot of what I'm going to say here isn't obvious unless you've thought about these particular types of issues. I'm going to be looking at the relationships between texts, which is not the same as the relationships between manuscripts. So when I look at two manuscripts that contain the same texts in the same order, I'm not saying that one was copied from the other. What I'm saying is that there is some shared textual material, that there is a similarity in text, that is to say in the abstract content. That similarity is reflected in the physical object, which is the only evidence we have of the abstract concept. But I'm studying the abstract concept. This is an important difference because if one finds, for example, two manuscripts whose contents correspond very closely, it is tempting to say the younger one was copied from the older one. After all, younger, older, kind of makes sense. But if we realize that we're comparing the texts and not the manuscripts, imagine for a moment that the younger manuscript is actually a very faithful copy of a much older manuscript. So what you find is a younger manuscript that reflects an older part of the textual tradition. And I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that, except to say that I'm not studying manuscripts here, I'm studying texts. Manuscripts are just the way I get at them. And I'm going to try to refer to the correspondences then in terms of shared textual material. The correspondences I find are non-directional. Now, in a certain sense, they are directional. What I mean by saying they're non-directional is I don't have an opinion about the direction, and there are ways one can get at those questions. They just aren't questions I'm asking. But it's given two manuscripts that correspond in their contents, one might say that the first is copied from the second, and by this I mean that the first one reflects a state in the textual tradition that is descended from the second one, or vice versa. Or they have a common source, and when I say that's interpreted recursively, what I mean is maybe they have sources that have a common source. There's really no way to pick that out. So what I'm talking about here when I speak about manuscripts that have something in common is just that they have something in common, and I'm not making any interpretation of how they got there. I'm also comparing just the tables of contents of the manuscripts and not the full text. I'm doing this for a reason of expediency. I don't have the manpower or the funding to have full text, but the tables of contents are supplied by the people who are participating in this research, mostly by colleagues at the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences. And we're working from a controlled vocabulary, which is to say when we identify something as the same text, say a particular sermon by a particular father of the church, we try to give it the same name. This is perilous business. We don't always get it right. When we find errors, we go back and correct them. But what we're trying to work with is standardized titles, standardized scientific titles that are supplied by scholars. One of the advantages here is that because, as we just said, scribes were free to tamper with their texts, you're typically not going to find situations where the full texts correspond perfectly. On the other hand, it is easy and indeed traditional for a Slavic scholar looking at these to say, this is a work I know, and to recognize when two things should be considered reflective of the same textual tradition. Here is a schematic of some of the possible patterns of agreement. Imagine in manuscripts 1 and 2, these are the contents in terms of table of contents. So in manuscript 1, there are 7 texts. I've given them titles that are just abstracted from the letters of the alphabet. Then there's manuscript 2, which has 8 texts, also letters of the alphabet. And through the color coding, one can see that there are 2 runs that they have in common. A and B occur adjacent and in the same order in both manuscripts, and C, D, and E occur adjacent and in the same order in both manuscripts. And it's patterns like this that tell me that although these are quite different in their makeup, they have correspondences that, once you get beyond a certain point, seem unlikely to have arisen by chance. And these are the kinds of patterns of agreement in my new mixed content miscellanies that attract my attention. If you look at the second pair, these are 2 hypothetical manuscripts that have 7 texts. They have exactly the same 7 texts in scrambled order. If one counts merely shared texts, manuscripts 3 and 4 seem to have more in common than manuscripts 1 and 2. On the other hand, manuscripts 1 and 2 have contiguity in common, contiguity in order, and not just the raw presence of a text. Now at this point we have to hypothesize how a scribe might have compiled a text, and when we see these runs of shared content where there's no logical reason that, say, texts C, D, and E should occur together repeatedly, we might imagine a monk in a monastery going into the scriptorium, pulling a book off the shelf, opening it to his favorite text, say the Life of Saint Brian of Rosenblum, and copying it. And he gets to the end, and then he says, gee, I still have some parchment left. And he happens to look beyond and sees the Life of Saint Ariane of Dwyer. And, oh yeah, it's an okay text. And he keeps copying. And the idea that a scribe who is copying might keep going is consistent with the idea that one might find these runs repeated. Now, it's not impossible that he pulled them off different shelves. It's not impossible that he, scribe independently decided to put these together. Indeed, if you find 2 texts together, it's not all that unlikely that it might have arisen by chance. If you find 15 texts together in the same order, as they say, what are the odds? So, I set about trying to come up with a system for evaluating which manuscripts were similar to which other manuscripts. And I was helped in this enterprise by knowing nothing about the mathematics of similarity. So I came up with a definition of similarity that strikes fear and terror into the hearts of mathematicians everywhere. Mathematical similarity, I subsequently learned, has certain axiomatic properties. For example, everything is perfectly similar to itself. Similarity varies between 0 and 1. If A is perfectly similar to B and B is perfectly similar to A, then A is perfectly similar to, A is perfectly similar to B and B to C, then A and C are, etc. I didn't know any of this. So what I conflated in my own mind was I was looking at actual similarity, how much they had in common, but I was also trying to factor into my comparisons the likelihood that the similarity did not arise by chance. For example, if I have 2 manuscripts that each contain 1 text and it happens to be the same text, well, big deal. If I have 2 manuscripts that each contain 10 texts in the same order, that is a big deal. And in the mathematical sense, each of those pairs instantiates perfect similarity, but the one that's more meaningful to me in drawing inferences about textual transmission is, of course, the longer one. Now, in order to do this, I had to do pairwise comparisons of the manuscripts, and these differ in their complexity. So if I have a manuscript and I want to find the others that are similar to it, this is said to be of linear complexity. And what's meant by linear complexity is as your corpus grows, the effort required to do the comparisons grows at the same rate. And when you think about that, if I have to compare one manuscript to 10, and then I have to compare one manuscript to 20, well, it takes twice as long. So the number of comparisons grows in proportion to the number of manuscripts. If I'm asking which manuscripts in the corpus are most like one another, on the other hand, I have to do pairwise comparisons across the corpus, and now things grow much faster. If I add one manuscript, it doesn't just increase the number of comparisons by 1. I have to compare that one to every other one that's already there. This gets difficult really quickly. if I have 5 manuscripts, I can do it in my head. But as you can see from the numbers here, and my testbed corpus is 100 manuscripts, I can't do 5,000 comparisons of this sort. I'm an old man. Never mind that I don't want to be able to limit this to 100 manuscripts. So I tried to come up with an evaluation system that would let me tell a computer to do this for me. Now, whether these comparisons, whether these similarities are meaningful is up to me, so it just tells me what to look at. But I don't waste my time doing pairwise comparisons of manuscripts that are going to have nothing to tell me. What I'm doing with this is I'm applying an approach that's come to be known as distant reading, which is kind of an elbow in the ribs to people who practice close reading. And the idea of distant reading is you don't actually read the stuff. What you do is you employ computational methods to tell you what you should read. You do read something closely, of course. You go back and look at the pairs that are meaningful, and that's what we're going to do toward the end of this talk. We're going to look very closely at specific pairs, but I didn't do that with 4,950 comparisons. I had to come up with a way of deciding which manuscripts were similar to which other ones, and one of my assumptions was that long matches are more highly valued than short matches. So a 6-article correspondence was worth more than 2 3s. And I had to come up with something where I could write the code, so it had to be kind of simple. I said that what counted for me was not just that the manuscripts had the same text, but that they were adjacent and that they were in the same order. I decided that the absolute position was irrelevant. I don't care whether, say, a sequence of 4 manuscripts is at the very 4 texts is at the very beginning of 2 manuscripts. If it's at the beginning of one and in the middle of another, it's given that copying model we talked about, where you pull a book from the shelf, you copy a few texts, you put it back, you pull down another book. It really doesn't matter what order the monk pulled the book in. What matters is that if he has the same text in the same order, he probably got it from somewhere else. I also hypothesized, and this is wrong, but it was a convenient hypothesis anyway, that the total number of articles in the manuscript was irrelevant. Now, I'm going to talk about the consequences of that assumption later. But based on that, I decided that the weight, and by weight I mean the degree of similarity as I was calling it, has to agree at a greater than linear rate. So that sequence of 6 manuscripts, of 6 texts, sequence of 6 texts has to be considered more important for my purposes than 2 sequences of 3. So what I did was I decided I would count for each pair of manuscripts how many, the length for each sequence of articles in the manuscript. I would add a point for the length, and then I would include all the subsequences. So with a sequence of 4, it's a sequence of 4. It contains 2 sequences of 3, plus 3 sequences of 2, plus 4 sequences of 1. You add them up. And this was kind of an arbitrary way to do it. I could have just squared the value. I could have done anything that would make it grow at a greater than arithmetic rate. This just happened to be one that was easy to calculate. But what it meant, because my method of making it grow at a greater than arithmetic rate was arbitrary, was that the absolute number didn't mean anything to me, but the relative weight did. I was going to get big numbers for long sequences, small numbers for short ones, and the big numbers were going to get big fast. It also meant that the weights were going to vary from 0 to infinity. And because they grow fast, there were going to be great leaps. So I tried to look at the relative order of the weights without placing too much emphasis on how great the numbers were. The actual probability is calculable. I was just too lazy to calculate it. And I, of course, compared the results I got through this automated process to the results I got the traditional way by picking a set of manuscripts and looking at them. It was consistent with traditional philological methods. For the moment, that's good enough. Now, this was important because a lot of people who do this kind of comparison use canned tools, and the problem with canned tools is they don't have a model for how manuscripts were copied. They have a notion of similarity, and it serves their purposes. It was not designed for this purpose, and it's not, I don't think it's really adaptable. For example, a lot of the traditional comparison methods that are built into freely available software tools will just look whether manuscripts have the same texts in common, but they won't take into consideration whether they're sequential and whether they're in the same order, and I needed that. One of the traditional methods for measuring how similar things are is something called edit distance, where you take 2 strings, in this case it would be 2 tables of contents, and you count the number of insertions, deletions, replacements, and transpositions that would be required to transform one into the other. This is used in genetics. It's used in a lot of disciplines. It may make sense in those disciplines, but it's not compatible with the sort of copying methods that we're thinking of for our scribes. So for that reason, I had to employ my own, and I had to do my own weighting. My testbed corpus was 104 manuscripts, which is what I happened to have. There were slightly more than 1,500 texts or articles spread over these 104 manuscripts, about 750 distinct ones. So on average, a text occurred twice in the corpus. The longest manuscript was 66 texts, the shortest was 1. The average was almost 15. Some of the texts occurred very frequently, some of them occurred only once. The ones that occurred once were, of course, of no use to me because they don't show any shared textual transmission. The manuscript types were a mixture of mixed content miscellanies, fixed content miscellanies, mostly prayer books, and then some non-miscellanies. If in the process of looking for which ones were like which other ones, it told me that a prayer book was like a mixed content miscellany, it would tell me I was doing something wrong. That isn't what happened. Now, these are kind of the top scores in the pairwise comparisons. Pay no attention to the raw numbers except to notice that they grow quickly. The stuff that begins with AM is a mixed content miscellany. The stuff that begins with DR is a prayer book. And one of the happy outcomes of this kind of comparison is that the mixed content miscellanies are like other mixed content miscellanies, and the prayer books are like other prayer books. Good. Given those weights, I then tried to look at whether I could get any insights into which manuscript should be compared to which other ones. And I threw these into a clustering program that took my weighting. I couldn't rely on its weighting because it didn't do the sorts of comparisons I did. And one of the happy things that shows up here is that the mixed content miscellanies cluster together, the fixed content miscellanies cluster together. The mixed content miscellanies that cluster together actually do have a lot of texts in common. So this is telling me that the weights I'm assigning are actually meaningful. And then I go in and look at these, and what this tells me is don't compare something on the way left of the chart with something on the way right of the chart. That would be a big fat waste of time. Let's take stock. The automated clustering yields results that are consistent with what we got the old-fashioned way, except now we can do it with whacking great heaps of manuscripts. And because there aren't too many of us, and it's estimated there are about 500,000 Slavic manuscripts in the world, most of which haven't been described yet. It's kind of nice if you don't have to look at all of them. We saw that the mixed miscellanies cluster with other mixed miscellanies, the fixed with fixed, and it's consistent with their actual contents when we look at them closely. We see that the length of the contiguous runs makes a difference. We're not just counting the number of shared texts. And we see that the mixed content miscellanies don't only cluster, they cluster tightly. So if you look at the degree of similarity is indicated by the position of the horizontal line along the y-axis. The lower on the screen the horizontal line is, the more similar the manuscripts are according to my measurements. And that chunk slightly to right of center is the chunk kind of in the center is some fixed content miscellanies. The chunk way over on the left is mixed content miscellanies. But what you see is that these clusters are pretty tight. So not only, the system will cluster everything. It will eventually say that everything is related to everything else. That's not true. So what we look at is only the most significant associations, but those are consistent with what we expect. Let's interpret what we have so far. It tells us that mixed content miscellanies are at least partially fixed, which is to say that there is some organizational principle, even if we don't know what it is and even if we can't define it, there is something governing their content that causes them to have content in common. It doesn't mean that every mixed content miscellany is equally likely to have something in common with every other mixed content miscellany, but it does mean that you can subgroup mixed content miscellanies not as easily as you can, say, distinguish prayer books from collections of saints' lives, but nonetheless there are clusters, there are groups in the tradition, and this is something that we could sort of detect it by eyeball, but we couldn't find it easily. We couldn't prove it, we couldn't demonstrate it, we couldn't find it easily in a large corpus. It also tells us that texts travel in convoys. Convoy is an old term in textual studies. It's used in the Russian tradition as a borrowing from convoy. But what's usually meant when Slavic textologists have talked about convoys is whether the texts occur in the same collection. These studies have not generally paid attention to whether they occur in the same order or whether they are contiguous, but one of the things that we notice is that order and contiguity actually do make a difference. It's not just co-occurrence. One of the things this tells us then is that the transmission of this cultural information might be more insightfully examined on the level of convoy rather than individual text. And in this sense, if we think about the way people will study the contents of libraries, whether they're monastic libraries or the libraries of rulers or something like that, where you're trying to get a sense of what people read and what they knew and what they knew about the world, what they knew about culture, what they knew about their own culture. And if we think of a miscellany as kind of a micro-library, it's the scribes, the monk's collection of the things that he thought he'd like to read again. And now that we notice that there are some patterns, it tells us something about the sorts of things that people were reading in combination with other things. There are, by the way, micro-miscellanies, as we've called them. For example, in a miscellany, there's one set of texts that we call, as a bunch, we call it the cycle of stories about Abraham. And it's apocryphal stories about the Old Testament patriarch Abraham. And when I looked at whether a manuscript contained the cycle of stories about Abraham or not. But inside that, the cycle of stories about Abraham is about a dozen stories, and they occur, guess what? They operate like a miscellany. So it's a hierarchical system, and you can go even one level deeper, and you could study the tradition of the cycle of stories about Abraham the same way you can study the tradition of, now that would be a fixed content miscellany because there's a unifying principle, but nonetheless there are some differences in order. This suggests also that the presence of a specific text in a miscellany may let you predict the presence or absence of another. And there are statistical tests that would let you do this. When you find that there are patterns of co-occurrence, well, there are patterns of co-occurrence. Whether the patterns are strong enough to let you make predictions, there are statistical tests that will let you know. I haven't done them, but it's a hypothesis for further exploration of this material. So, there is a problem with small manuscripts because the weighting system that I came up with depends on the number of contiguous matches. The poor small manuscripts don't have a chance. If you have two one-article manuscripts, they can never have a weight greater than 1, and they just disappear in the bottom of the chart. So I redid the calculations based on the percentage of potential similarity. So in that case, if you had two one-article manuscripts and they agreed, they had achieved 100% of their potential agreement and they got a very high weight. Now, the likelihood that that arose by chance is nonetheless fairly great, so you can bounce back and forth between the raw count versus the percentage, and what the percentage helps you avoid overlooking short manuscripts that should be examined side by side. On the other hand, the likelihood that their similarity is significant is never going to be as great as the likelihood for larger manuscripts. We have limited time, so this helps us decide where to spend it. Once I decided which manuscripts to look at side by side, I wondered whether there were patterns of agreement among them, and if so, whether there was a way to determine how they might be similar and how they might not. And for this, I used a visualization system called a plectogram. And what you're looking at here is two columns, each of which represents a manuscript. Each of the cells represents a text in the manuscript. The 4-digit hexadecimal numbers, which is to say the inscrutable numbers after the ones that make sense, are unique identifiers for the texts. And I took a look at the ones that should be compared side by side, and I drew these so that I could see visually what they had in common. This is 2 prayer books. And what you can see, and I drew a connecting line if they had the same text. So if you look at number 8 on the left, it's 001B. That corresponds to number 5 on the right, which is 001B. But what you can see at a glance here, it's really hard to see if you're just looking at the list of table of contents, never mind if you're looking at it for lots of manuscripts. What you can see at a glance here is that these manuscripts have an awful lot of texts in common. Some of them are contiguous, some of them are in the same order, some of them aren't. And this is a pattern that you might expect to find in a prayer book, because they're prayer books and there's a limited inventory of prayers and there are certain prayers that are likely to show up. It's not surprising they have a lot of texts in common. That's not particularly indicative of shared textual transmission. This is a fixed content miscellany and they're of the same genre. On the other hand, those runs of contiguous texts in the same order tell us that that's something we have to look at more closely. If they happen to be texts that belong together in some logical identifiable way, it's less interesting. In that case, you can understand why they're together. On the other hand, if they're texts that don't have any particular logical connection, then what you're looking at is a sort of mixed content miscellany phenomenon inside a fixed content miscellany. Now, and at this point, you have to pull out the books and you have to look at, you have to dereference those numbers. And in the live version of this, you run a mouse over it and it tells you what the title is. I use the numbers just because it was easier to display it on the screen. But so you can explore it and you can see whether it's something that requires further examination or not. But what I see in this prayer book is that there is really strong thematic unity because they're both prayer books, so they're the same genre. There's a great deal of coincidence in which articles they contain, and there seems to be a lot of coincidence in the sequences, and particularly in the microsequences. And this is a typical pattern for fixed content miscellanies. Hugh Olmsted, who developed the plectogram visualizations, was careful to say that what they do is provide a graphic representation of similarities. They don't tell you that the manuscripts are related. What they tell you is that they have some of the same contents, but they let you see that in a way that you can't see just with the text. So it lets you manage a large amount of data, and it lets these patterns jump out at you. And we're going to spend the rest of our time today looking at some of these patterns and talking about the ways manuscripts may or may not be similar. These are two mixed content miscellanies, and one of the things we see immediately is they have almost the same content, and it's almost entirely in the same order. It's almost entirely contiguous. You could barely ask for greater similarity than this. These are almost twins. But the really cool thing is those crisscross lines in the middle. What those are telling us is that the same text occurs twice, the same two texts occur twice in the manuscripts. So on the left side, text number 14 and 15 match with 15 and 16 on the right, and also with 21 and 22 on the right. And also with 20 and 21. So you see that crisscross pattern. Boy, did this not happen by accident. It's very easy to see that these are different branches of the tradition, of the same tradition, that you can see that there's a lot of shared textual material here, and it strains credulity to suggest that it could have arisen other than by shared transmission. Now, it seems peculiar if a scribe is compiling a miscellany that he would include the same texts twice. What, he forgot he wrote it the first time? He wasn't paying attention? And you have to go back and look at them and see what's going on. There are several likely explanations, and I don't have the full description of the manuscript here, so I can't go back and look at it on the spot. One possibility is that he was compiling from other sources, and maybe he copied, say, texts 1 through 17 on the left from one source, like, say, copied a whole book and then put it back and picked up another one, and he copied the next one, and he just kept going, and it didn't matter to him that the text was already there, because copying is also a devotional act, and you copy. It's also possible that the manuscript has more than one scribe, and it's something that's very easy to tell when you go back and look at it. But what's important in terms of patterns of agreement is when you see texts repeated in two manuscripts, when you see this degree of comparison, this pattern is unmistakable. Now, there's a gap in the bottom. And so text 31 on the left corresponds to 32. Then there's a gap where 32 skips and 33 and 34 skip. And then 33 on the left picks up with 35, and they keep going. And what this typically means is that the Slavist made an error. So I went back and looked at the titles. These manuscript descriptions were prepared by different people. They all work in the Institute of Literature, but they work from common lists. But they have to look at these manuscripts and decide which of the available titles in their inventory of 750 titles they should apply. So number 297 was Questions of St. John the Theologian to Abraham. 298 was Questions of St. John the Theologian to Abraham, fragment. I bet those are the same. So this tells us to go back and take another look. But for our classification purposes today, this is one pattern of agreement. It's a very strong one. And it's clear that there's something of interest going on here. You can compare two manuscripts that have something in common. These are not the same two on the left, but it's one of them is the same and the other one is different. And if you notice the one on the right, it's got a lot of texts in common. Maybe about a third of its texts are found in the other two. But look at the spaghetti between the two of them. There is no identifiable shared textual transmission going on here. Nothing's parallel, nothing's contiguous. There's a lot of stuff in common. And I don't just mean that number 3 stands out compared to number 1 and 2. I mean that number 3 has a degree of overlap with number 1 and 2 that shows some similarity in interest, but doesn't show any similarity in the transmission of the texts. If we take a look at so kind of an expanded version, we can see going over on the 3 on the right, we can see that these are manuscripts that were pretty much copied verbatim from the same sources. Whether one was copied from another or they have a common ancestor is unclear. Some of the differences may be editing errors, or some of them may reflect that in the middle they were copied from the same source, but maybe the scribe started out differently or ended differently. Manuscripts are often damaged, and often we're missing the beginnings and ends of them, and various funny stuff can happen on the end, so we tend to look more closely in the middle. And we can see going off on the left, in this case we do have correspondences that are parallel, we do have correspondences that are contiguous, and what this suggests is there may be small parts of the tradition that traveled together. If you look at, say, between the second and third from the left, about halfway down, you see several diagonal lines in a row, and that may be a cluster that moved together and made it into those 4 manuscripts on the right, but the 3 on the right had more stuff around it in their common ancestor as they were being copied. So already we're getting a view of different ways that manuscripts can correspond, and we're noticing that beyond the raw sharing of texts, we're seeing that in some cases they have a lot of texts in common in ways that don't suggest shared textual transmission, and in other cases they have things in common that really do suggest shared textual transmission. This is probably our closest twinning pair. There's a little bit of something different going on the top. Anisawa looked at these actual manuscripts and determined based on external evidence that the one on the left seemed to have been copied from the one on the right. We can't tell from these methods whether one was copied from another. All we can see is that there's really something going on here. But whether they have a common ancestor or not is hard to tell. And often the manuscripts will have a colophon, and it'll tell you where they were copied and by whom. And there are ways one can obtain information about them other than by looking at the contents. This is a pattern that Hugh Olmsted called focusing, and this is in this case you have a sequence of texts that is in the same order in the 2 manuscripts, but on the left side there are gaps in the middle, and there are 2 logical explanations for this pattern. One, imagine that the scribe on the right is creating a manuscript based on the tradition on the left. He reads through it in order, and he picks the texts he likes, and he skips the ones he doesn't like. And that's a perfectly reasonable way of copying. I don't know about you guys, but that's the way I read books of short stories. So why shouldn't he? Alternatively, you might imagine that the scribe on the left is working from a text from the tradition on the right and going through it and copies a bunch of texts and then thinks, oh, there's something else that kind of belongs with them, and goes off and pulls it out of another book and then continues. And you can't tell from this visualization, you can't tell from this information which of those 2 patterns describes what happens. And you have to go and look. You have to look at what the specific texts are. But what this is illustrating is another pattern. This is a very common pattern in correspondences. Olmsted was studying the manuscripts of Maxime Grec, who was a polymath. And the collections he was working with were collections of the works of Maxime Grec, so that was their selectional principle. But he noticed this focusing pattern. Here they emerge in mixed content miscellanies as well. It tells you something about the way people copied books. It doesn't tell you, which of these interpretations, whether it was selection or expansion, is most appropriate here. But it nonetheless reveals a pattern that shows up repeatedly in different contexts. This is really cool, and one possible explanation is that the first 4 texts on the left come from one tradition, the 5 below it come from another, and these 2 manuscripts were compiled independently, each taken from those traditions, and there's something else going on in the middle and the one on the right. In this case, because we could look at the manuscripts, we have a more innocent explanation. The manuscript came apart, and when they rebound it, they put the pages in the wrong order, and this happens. So this tells us this is not a reflection of the copying. This is a reflection of what happened to the manuscript after it was copying. This is a cautionary tale. After it was copied, this is a cautionary tale for all of us. This is a compilation relationship. The one you want to look at is the second one from the left, because what's going on here is the stuff on the top all comes from the tradition to the right. The stuff on the bottom all comes from the tradition to the left. So what you're seeing is that and again, we don't know the directionality. We don't know whether the scribe on the left just sort of opened the manuscript in column 2 or something like it in the middle and started copying from there, or whether the scribe of the manuscript in column 2 copied from the tradition in 3 and 4 up to a point and then put it aside and then picked up the tradition in column 1 and started copying from there. But we see nonetheless that the one in column 2 seems to have a relationship on the one hand with the stuff to the left, on the other hand with the stuff to the right. And again, it's the contiguity, it's the order that tells you. Now those crossing lines in the top were something that we had to look at specifically. Those are all texts attributed to St. John Chrysostom. The insertion in as item number 4 in column 2 is a preface attributed to Chrysostom. So it looks like, to the extent that these came from the same source, it looks like somebody was rearranging them with some deliberation. And whether having 4 texts in different order has to reflect deliberate rearrangement, or whether those are all by Chrysostom, they all have something in common, that could very well have been drawn upon independently. There's something going on there that requires more attention. But the moment that attracted me, the moment that caught my attention, was that the way column 2 seems to draw from 2 very different traditions. Now, we had looked up until now mostly at mixed content miscellanies. This is the fixed content miscellany tradition. Columns 2 and 3 are the ones we looked at the beginning, the ones that have a lot in common, some contiguity, some parallel lines, but not a whole lot. But what we see here is that even within fixed content miscellanies, that is to say where there are thematic reasons that the same text might occur, we can nonetheless see that the number of texts that are similar between, say, columns 2 and 3 versus 3 and 4 it's pretty much the same. But 3 and 4 are much more suggestive of shared textual transmission than 2 and 3. And in fact, if you look at these 6 guys, it looks like 1 and 2 seem to come from one branch of the tradition, 3, 4, 5, and 6 seem to come from another. So this tells us that even in fixed content miscellanies, where we expect to have a lot of texts in common, we can nonetheless draw some conclusions based on the texts that are contiguous and based on the texts that are in the same order. Some of the conclusions we can draw from looking at this then is that on the one hand, scribes are free to choose whatever they please in their mixed content miscellanies. And it's almost unheard of for them to copy a miscellany exactly. Now, we saw some that were awfully close. We didn't see any that were perfectly matched. One of the things we also notice from these patterns is that the unit of selection, when you're compiling a miscellany, is not necessarily the individual text. It looks as if texts travel together in what we called convoys, and that sequences of articles could be copied as sequences, and that furthermore, some sequences seem to be stable to some degree within the tradition. The sequences are not necessarily thematic. They could be, but often they aren't. That now that once we notice that they occur together, it's reasonable for us to ask, is there a reason they do? And I don't have an answer to that question yet, but that's indeed one of the questions that this leads us to. If we notice that mixed content miscellanies are fixed, well, fixed content miscellanies are fixed, as we said, because they have something in common. There's a reason the texts travel together. So is there a reason that these convoys move together? And I don't think there's a general answer to that, but it tells us at least what we should look at together. The thematic unity, as we saw in some of our fixed content miscellanies, thematic unity means, for example, a prayer book contains prayers. But thematic unity doesn't dictate sequence. Sequence tells you that there's something else going on. And finally, that there are patterns, identifiable subtypes of these correspondences that allow us to focus on particular copying methods. So that pattern that we called focusing, for example, tells us one thing about the way the copying was done. That manuscript that we looked at that drew from two different branches of the tradition tells us something else. The pattern of rebinding tells us something else once we figure out that that's what's going on. So there's in fact a lot going on that goes beyond whether texts just have the same, whether manuscripts have the same texts in common. Now let me back up, since I'm at the concluding moment here, and say that before we started looking at these computationally, my colleagues were trying to wrangle all of this evidence on whacking great sheets of paper that they would spread on the floor, and they would write all the manuscripts down the side and all the texts on the top, and they would put numbers in the cells according to their order in the manuscript, and you can see where this was going to end. But we have a handle on a fairly large corpus. We can focus our attention where we think it belongs. We're getting results that are, on the one hand, we're getting results that are consistent with what we knew before, and that tells us that our methods are not crazy. And on the other hand, we're noticing things we didn't notice before, and when we go back and look at them, they make sense. So this is enabling us to find information that's hiding in plain view that would have been awfully difficult for us to determine without some of the methods we've employed here. So thank you all for your attention.
Absolutely fascinating. I wish someone had done this for English as well.
It works for English.
Yeah, no, I can see that. I have a comment and then a question that goes with that. There's been quite a lot of discussions about convoys in English, but they're usually referred to as booklets. And people have found that there are these things that people copy over and over again in booklets, and they very often go in, so they correspond to gatherings or choirs in manuscripts. And I was wondering if that is what is going on here, that when they went to get text, they didn't go to a book, but they actually went to a booklet in the library and copied that booklet. And then that's why you see some of these sort of chunks of corresponding texts. So is there some evidence for these booklets existing in libraries? Do you know of any?
There is evidence, and I actually have it, and until today I didn't think to look at it. In the manuscript descriptions, we know where, we have the binding information, we know the foliation, and we know the pagination of the texts. That's a really easy thing to check, and I never thought of it before. Very cool.
Because there's quite a lot of research on it in English, and quite a lot of theorizing about the booklets and the book market and all that. And how it works.
Thank you.
When you go on to look at the clusters that you find, do you then use measures like regional provenance, scriptoria, or decoration, river separation, iconography? Are there any other ways, are there any other kind of filters that you could put these very similar texts through that would perhaps allow you to figure out the relationship on another kind of frame?
There's an emerging methodology in digital manuscript studies that has come to be known as quantitative codicology, where we take the descriptive features of books, all of them, the physical description, the contents, the language, and look for similarities and perform clustering on those levels. And it's a difficult thing to juggle because certain types of information, it's easy for one type of information to overwhelm the rest. So I'm doing a study now of some of these materials for a conference in a couple of weeks. And it's the sort of thing that goes beyond my competences in statistics. So I have a statistician working with me on it, and he said, for example, for the contents, it's very hard to merge the sort of weighting that I was using with the traditional statistical, quantitative, and categorical variables. And if you're working with, say, just Boolean values, does the manuscript have illuminations or doesn't it? And does it have decorative initials or doesn't it? And does it have a calendar at the end or doesn't it? It's very easy for the proliferation of those values to swamp everything else. The strongest correlation we found, we took a test bed of about 20 manuscripts, most of them Gospels, and because we happened to have pretty clear descriptions of those, and we found that the strongest correlation among the variables, not surprisingly, was the physical measurements, the size of the page, the size of the writing area, the size of the column. Well, that's not all that interesting. The aspect ratio of books, there is variation, but the aspect ratio of books isn't the most exciting thing. What I was hoping to find was that, say, a certain feature of the orthography, whether they used, the sort of the distribution of letters that could be distributed variously, but in, say, one of 6 ways. I wanted to find a correlation between that and the presence of decorative initials, or what I was hoping to find was that what would emerge would be a correspondence of the sort that I would never have known to look for. And of course, given with a 5% confidence interval, 5% of the time, those are going to emerge and are not going to be meaningful. So you have to know what to do with it. But the integration of these other features with the contents is certainly where we want to go next. We just have to find a way to keep them in balance.
I still think that the book has diversity enough, because even if the date of a manuscript copy doesn't tell you anything about the provenance or what was copied first, I think it might cluster things in terms of date, so that part of these cycling through manuscripts might have everything to do. I mean, I can give the example of manuscripts of perhaps the most famous French medieval romance writer. A stela was produced about 100 years ago that showed the relativity of 2 copies. When they looked at the book counts, they found that things that had been dated 110 years apart were by the same guy. And so, I don't know, you might find unexpected results by clustering by date as well as by content, and trying to maybe cross-reference that with, you may find, for example, there's one scriptorium that had a copy that everybody else copied. You may find that
a lot of the medieval Balkan manuscripts were created on Mount Athos, and there were essentially national Orthodox monasteries there, but they were in contact, and they borrowed one another's books, and monks went between them. And if you find a manuscript that contains, say, the Hilandar Charter, it probably comes from the Serbian Hilandar monastery, but not necessarily. They moved around. The provenance is in the Balkan Middle Ages, the national tradition wasn't as important as it's come to be, and there's even disagreement about what counts as a Bulgarian manuscript, and disagreement tends to involve the Bulgarians and the Macedonians, but in a way it's an anachronistic question. On the other hand, we do know of certain scriptoria, and we can identify certain moments in the scribal tradition, certain orthographic reforms or something, and we have that information in our descriptions. We don't yet have a methodology for combining that with, say, this content-based information, other than, of course, to look at it, which ultimately is what we're going to do. These are all discovery tools, and once I notice that there are certain patterns of agreement, and I have hypotheses about them, you go back and look, and sometimes the hand will tell you something, and sometimes there'll be some other feature. We have watermark information for the ones that are on paper. The descriptions are inconsistent in the sorts of ways that descriptions are inconsistent when you have teams of people working on them, and
have a date range of your sample?
I don't remember what it is. I think we go back to probably to the 10th century, so we have some of the earliest Slavic manuscripts, and I think we probably go up to the 18th. In this test bed, I don't have the earliest or the latest, and I don't remember now the dates were, what the dates are. It was compiled sort of opportunistically. The scholars who were working on the descriptions were using the manuscripts that they had to use for their other projects anyway. They had to prepare the description, so they just prepared them in a form that let me do something with them. So, so it's not, which in a way is helpful. It's not a random sample, but it's an arbitrary sample. And I don't know what happens when you say pull in the earliest ones and the latest ones. In the later period, in some parts of the tradition, you do get some very exact copying, and you get, but in this middle period, in the Balkans, you get great variation. One of the things that I tried clustering on was the color of the ink, and the descriptions are just all over the place, and most of them start with the word black. And it's then black with red initials, black with big red initials, black with pink in the margins and big red initials. And how do you, with 20 manuscripts, I just read them and I can see which ones have something in common. With 100, how am I going to keep track of it? And so one of the things I tried was just keep the first word, because some of them are brown. So okay, black and brown, two values. One of them was written as dark brown, so I get dark. Thanks very much. And so there's the inconsistencies that arrive inevitably when you have different people doing the descriptions are, they can be frustrating. On the other hand, they tell us what we need to pay attention to. And I am still hopeful that the quantitative codicological methods are going to tell me something. And of course, whether you write a particular letter this way or that way is, on the one hand, independent of the kind of binding you have, assuming it's not rebound. On the other hand, if you find correspondences in a variety of places, it might suggest that there's a common scriptorium behind it. And in a sense, it's just a coincidence that they did this and they did that. But the fact that those were done together tells you maybe they were done by the same people.
I very much like your model.
Thank you.
I like the reflectogram, and I'm wondering how you generate those. How do you think those? Are you using some kind of programming to do that, or?
Okay, I promised I wouldn't talk about digital humanities here. No, okay. The manuscript descriptions are in a particular structured format. They're in XML, and they're in XML according to a particular schema. And I used XSLT, which is a programming language designed to work with XML, to convert them to SVG, which is a graphic format that's also based in XML. So it's a very easy transformation. So underneath the surface on the plectograms, what looks like a drawing is angle brackets and text, and it's a description that the browser interprets and renders, but because it's XML, it's a very easy transformation to automate.
So you can choose two manuscripts and generate
Yeah, these were all generated programmatically. I didn't draw any of them. And one of the things, one of the limitations of the plectogram visualization is that it shows the similarities between adjacent pairs of manuscripts. But if I have a plectogram of 6 manuscripts strung across, there are no connecting lines between say the first and the fifth. And I tried drawing those, and I wound up with what the technical term for this is that I wound up with a hairball. So, and I looked at some alternative visualizations, and there are some that will work with a small number. In the live version, which I don't have with me at the moment, they're animated. So when you mouse over a cell, not only does the actual title appear, so you're not just looking at an inscrutable 4-digit number, but all of the other cells anywhere in the plectogram and all the connecting lines that are the same as the one you've moused over change color. So if, say, there's one here and there's one here and they have something in common and there's no connecting line, at least the color will cause it to pop out. One of the things that I'd like to do is, as I was drawing the plectograms, if I knew that there were, say, 6 manuscripts I wanted to look at together, I experimented with the order to put them in order to maximize the number of connecting lines. That's mathematically tractable, and based on the dendrogram, based on the tree, I can put the ones that have the highest similarity rating next to each other, and that's something I can automate. So I don't have it running at the moment, but I had a system up on my server at one point where there was a list of the 100 manuscripts, and you next to each one you specify the position you want it to occupy in the plectogram, and then you punch a button and the system gives you back a plectogram. So my colleagues in Bulgaria were able to experiment with these visualizations as a research tool without my having to do any coding for them. It was I did it, at that point I did it all with XSLT, because when I first wrote this there was no XQuery. The reason it's down now is I'm rewriting it in XQuery, which is a better technology for this kind of visualization, but it works with XSLT. I mean, they're both transformations of XML.
How about the dendrogram?
The dendrogram came out of an open source statistical package called R, and R is kind of a black box. With the plectograms, I wrote every line of code myself. I know exactly what it does, and if it doesn't do what I want, I can make it do what I want. But clustering is hard, and it's mathematically difficult, and it's mathematically beyond my abilities. I can't envision and write the formulae, so I had to rely on a canned application and did it. But what I did was R will cluster. I mean, you have to give it the numerical data. R doesn't work with plain text. But the part I had to do to get the clustering that I wanted was decide what I was comparing and how I wanted to weight it. So if, for example, if I had done real mathematical similarity and come up with things along those scales and looked at just whether 2 manuscripts have the same text or not without looking at the order and the contiguity, R would have given me very different clusters. There are different clustering methods supported by R. I used an approach called agglomerative clustering, where you take a look at your stuff and you start pulling them together according to which ones are most similar, and then you tack other things onto them. And within agglomerative clustering, there are also different approaches. The dendrogram that I showed you used complete linkage, which is a very conservative method. And if we go back to it for a second, I don't have the others with me, but I can describe what the alternatives are like. What you'll notice here is that it gives up pretty quickly. So there's a lot of stuff. Ultimately, it thinks everything's connected. So everything is connected at the very top of the diagram. And what that's saying is it all forms one cluster. And that's an artifact of the method. But you can see there's a lot of stuff that doesn't seem to be connected to anything, and which is to say it's given up. And complete linkage is conservative this way. It doesn't form a cluster. And I mean there's a technical explanation, which I will not give you because I don't remember the details of how it decides when to give up. There are other methods that are more promiscuous and that will give you greater chaining. So instead of just giving up and sort of toward the end and saying the last 25% are all just sort of equally at the bottom, it will chain off. So it'll sort of like one at a time, it'll spin them off, and you get this little cascade of connections. And there is a mathematical way to determine where to draw the line, where to say that the clustering is an artifact of the system and where it's not. What I did is this is an exploratory tool. I mean, it doesn't give you conclusions about your data. It tells you what to look at. And I threw the same data set at several different clustering methods. And my working hypothesis was where they agree, it probably tells me something about the data. Where they don't agree, maybe tells me something about the methods. If I knew more about statistics, I might actually be able to determine which of the methods was more appropriate for my data. And my university it has a separate department of statistics, and they maintain a consultancy for faculty. And they gave me a consultant this semester. It's a graduate student who is fascinated with this stuff because all he ever sees up there are psychological surveys and sociological surveys, and and here he has problems he's never thought of before. So I'm hoping to learn through this how one identifies the kinds of tests that are most suitable here. I mean, this is kind of a fast and dirty approach, but the fact that it gave me results that are consistent with what I know from having been a Slavic philologist all my life, tells me that I now have the ability to wrangle a much larger data set than would have been possible otherwise.
I'd like to go back on a question from that the scribe putting together a mixed miscellany may actually not be complete freedom as to what he chooses, and the presence of texts that travel in convoys is part of the evidence for that. So, can you get more information out by looking at whether those texts always or almost always travel in convoys? In other words, if we're going to have one, we're going to have, let's say, all four. And you very rarely have just one or another, and can get through this statistical analysis like that as well.
That's an easy test, because once you're looking for one particular thing and what travels with it, that's much easier than just saying which of these have something in common. And I mean, if we think of this, I'm going to make up an example, but I think it's a sensible one. It's very common to find the four Gospels together in a book. It wasn't necessarily in the Slavic Middle Ages. They organized their Bibles primarily for lectionary purposes. But and if you're going to find three Gospels together, it's probably going to be the Synoptic Gospels. If you find three Gospels and it's not the Synoptic Gospels, you've probably got a defective book. So there are, this is a made-up example, but one could imagine that there are other things that you would normally expect to find together. I haven't run those tests, and this is a common type of statistical testing. In terms of clustering, you can determine which of the variables, you can determine the extent to which each variable contributes to the formation, to the definition of the clusters. And in that sense, you can determine what the predictability is from one to another, which I think is kind of interesting. For example, if I'm looking for, often we find manuscripts where we haven't identified all of the texts to our satisfaction. Maybe we don't know what they are, or maybe we see, for example, some of these gaps, and this is a really convenient way to see where you might have made a mistake. But if there's a text that I can't identify, and often they're defective. It's the way we typically identify these is with incipiteria. So we have because they often don't have titles. It doesn't say it's somebody's sermon about something else, and if it does, that may not be right anyway. But we look at the way the text begins, and we look it up in Incipitarium, and that tells us what it is, and we assign a scientific name to it. But often the beginning is missing, and we often don't have full text because Slavists are poor, and we can't transcribe this stuff. We don't get grants. So how are you going to identify it? And to the extent that you can do it based on the presence of other texts, you make your life a lot easier.
But it occurs to me that it also will tell us something. If, let's say, you see these hypothetical vortex together all the time, and you very rarely see any one of them in places, it tells us something about what these unwritten rules might be, about what the limits were to creative borrowing of text for the purposes of the miscellany.
Well, if you see the same four texts together all the time, why are you calling them four texts? I can show you something else. This is I'm not sure whether this will work, but let me see if I can get it up. This is a somewhat different project, but it deals with some of the same issues. This is a well-known Slavic text written by a character known as Daniel the Prisoner. Whether there was a Daniel and whether he was a prisoner are unclear. it's a petition, or it purports to be a petition to a prince, where Daniel is asking the prince to restore his whatever it was that was taken away from him when he got in trouble. And it exists, there are two branches of the tradition called the Slova and the Malenia, and they are sufficiently similar that it's clear that they have some sort of common origin. Whether one was, the Malenia is longer, and whether the Slova was a condensed version of the Malenia, or the Malenia was an expanded version of the Slova, or whether they're both descended from something else is unclear. The way scholars normally talk about this is they say they have common textual material, they have a shared textual tradition. So one of the things we wanted to explore was what the relationships are between them, and we took a plectogrammatic approach. And what we were trying to do here, I'm doing this project together with Robert Romanchuk from Florida State University, and what we're trying to do is come up with what we've come up with is something that we, by which I mean Rob, thinks replicates to some extent the medieval practice of reading. The genre here is a florilegium, which is a collection of pithy sayings. In the tradition, they're called gnomes, and some of them seem to follow naturally from one another, and in other cases, it's just like you took a bunch of catchy sayings and put one after another. But what you have up here is a plectogram that shows those are the Slova texts on the top and the Malenia texts on the bottom, and you can walk through them and sort of move along and see where they correspond. So you can see, for example, these guys are aligned, and then there are other places. There are some that have nothing that corresponds to it, and I mean, this is an exploratory tool. It's a way to walk through the tradition and see what's going on. You can reset it and go back to the beginning and sort of pick up anywhere and walk along and see what's happening. And what we're trying to do here is, this is a really complicated tradition. You look at the spaghetti in the plectogram, but there are nonetheless certain patterns of correspondence that do pop out, and certain places where you have things that do seem to move in parallel. And this is a way to help visualize it. And you can do it either by walking through the plectogram or by walking through the text.
What do you think this does to the concept of the addition? And I know, for example, in medieval studies there was a lot of talk a few years back up in new philology, which meant that rather than establishing the text and balancing out the text using different variants, that the right way to do an addition is just to present all the text. So, you've got something much more open plan than the concept we have of the Ur text, as it were, or the perfect text.
The one big textual addition I did, I don't remember whether I have this up here or not. No, let me see if I have it on my other server. The one big paper traditional textual edition I did was the Rus Primary Chronicle. I was the junior editor on this. I had the good fortune to be included in the project when I was still a graduate student. And there were 5 principal manuscripts, and then a bunch of subsidiary ones we turned to where the principal ones are defective. And then we also looked at some of the other previous critical editions. And the approach we took here was we created an interlinear collation. So what you see at the bottom, for example, is one line of text with the readings from all of the manuscripts arranged one under another. And we published this on paper. It's 3 volumes. It's 2,800 pages. It's 11 and a half inches on your shelf. And from the day it was published, we already knew where some of the typos were, and it's a big book. So but I think the key to this is this bottom line, this Ost, was the reconstruction done by Donald Dostrovsky, who was the primary editor. And I think that's in a sense, what we did was we threw all of the evidence at our readers. And we were trying to address a couple of problems with traditional critical editions. The first is that they're illegible. If typically you have a primary text and then you have the variants in footnotes, and sometimes the primary text is a particular witness, and you can read that and see where there are significant variants. Sometimes it's compiled or constructed. It's not a real manuscript witness, and it's the editor's interpretation of what the alpha text might have looked like, and then where the manuscripts actually diverge from that, that'll be in the footnotes. In either case, if you want to read the continuous text, you're good. If you want to try to reconstruct what any particular witness said, you get a headache. So one of the problems we were trying to address here was to make it possible to read any of the witnesses fully. And the second problem with traditional critical editions is that they're selective. And they include what the editor considered a significant variant. Don is a historian, I'm a linguist, and a significant variant for him may not be significant for me, or more often the reverse. And if a variant isn't there, you don't know whether that means there's no variation or whether it just means whatever variation there wasn't of interest to the editor. So for those reasons, we decided we had to produce all of the evidence. On the other hand, one of our teachers was a Russian historian named Ned Keenan, who said, you can't publish an edition where you say, I read 20 manuscripts, now you go read 20 manuscripts. The editor has a responsibility, and that's the point of the Ostline. That's Don's interpretation of the evidence according to principles, and they're consistent with a traditional schematic approach, although he, which is, believe it or not, was controversial in the tradition of the study of this text, because the Russians don't do it that way. And the way we set this up is, this is Don's reconstruction up on the top. So if you're a historian and you want to kind of read along and see what the text says, you just read. And if you come to some place where you actually want to see, why did the editor say it was that? Well, if you click there, the stuff down below will scroll and it'll show you all of the variants. Now, I threw this together in about a day, and it's not the best of electronic editions. I was able to do it because as we were preparing the paper edition, I was able to adapt the files and convert them to a format that was usable online. But there are lots of other things you could do with this. For example, the only reading version now is the reconstruction. Why shouldn't you have your choice of reading versions? If you're interested in one particular manuscript, put that one on top and keep everything else on the bottom. And so there are lots of other things we can do with this, and the electronic texts give us that ability to do it. So I've always been uncomfortable with the idea that I don't have access to all of the information. On the other hand, I'd like the editor to do some work too, even if I'm the editor. And for some of the editions I put up, I've done multiple views. So with some of them, I'll have the, I can show you one that, this is one of the Old Church Slavonic manuscripts, one of our oldest ones. So I have the facsimile on this side, I have the Old Church Slavonic transcription there, and I have the interlinear Greek. And it's a different view of the same data, but it's one that makes it very easy for, if you think I may have made a transcription error, well, go over and check. And if you don't know how to read a manuscript because you don't have the paleographic training, that's okay, I've transcribed it for you. And if you want to see what the Greek says, well, there it is. Now, there are some issues with this text concerning the establishment of the Greek tradition, because there's both Slavic and Greek textology going on here, and it's awfully hard to support both of them at once. It's I'm not sure how one does a tradition, how one does an edition of something like this, where the Greek and the Slavic are both important. How does one do an edition that provides the equivalent of a critical apparatus for both the Slavic and for the Greek? And as a Slavist, the Greek helps me out, and I'm more interested in the Slavic tradition, but that's kind of shortchanging the Greek one. And this Greek one is compiled. This is not a transcription from a Greek manuscript. This is drawn from different branches of the Greek tradition to reconstruct, or rather to construct, a Greek text that is as close as possible to the Slavic. So every word there is drawn from a Greek manuscript, but they're drawn from a bunch of different ones. It's a really audacious approach. I didn't do it, so I'm neither bragging nor apologizing. That's the Greek text that we've adopted for this edition.
Well, I notice here, if we can talk about this for just a second, even though that's not really
Please.
the presentation, that when you are transcribing it on the left, you're spacing between words, although you're not adding in punctuation. In this case, I'm not so sure that your space between words is accurate, but sometimes you can't always tell. And are there principles involved in how the spacing between words is done and where that's done?
Most of the time we can tell. There are places where we can't, and there are traditions in Slavic philology. There are some cases where you have a letter that is properly part of the words on either side, and it's sort of standing for both. And there's a tradition of using hyphens for certain purposes. And since there are no hyphens in the manuscript, every hyphen that appears on the left would be editorial. Likewise, because there's no interword spacing, there's no ambiguity. The spacing on the left is editorial. And I'm not the final editor on that part, so there are principles, and even well-established ones, for what Slavists do in these transcriptions. And most of the time it's not controversial, which is good for us. But as you can see in the text on the right, even if you can't read the Cyrillic, you can see that there aren't spaces between words. There's a space after a mid-dot, which is kind of the only punctuation. But it's difficult, even for Slavic philologists, to read continuous text, especially if it's typeset. I find it easier to read continuous text in handwriting in the manuscript than I would if the stuff on the left were run together. So inserting the word spaces it's kind of traditional. And because we have the facsimile right next to it, it's very easy to see. There's no misunderstanding about what's editorial and what's original. You can see what's original.
Well, we have exceeded 5 o'clock, barely. So, thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for a wonderful talk.